This next story we're going to talk about is a heartbreaking case of a missing child. What started out to be a fun family outing on a pleasant summer day would soon take a horrible turn. Sadly, this would not be the last time this family would face unspeakable tragedy. Let's talk about Nyleen K. Marshall. Nyleen K. Briscoe was born on September 18, 1978, to Bill and Nancy Briscoe. They would divorce shortly after, and Nyleen would be adopted by Nancy's new husband, Kim Marshall, thus making her name Nyleen K. Marshall. Nyleen grew up in the house with her two parents and two siblings, older brother Nathan and younger sister Noreen. They made their home in Alhambra, Montana, and by all accounts were a happy, all-American Mormon family. On Saturday, June 25, 1983, the Marshall family attended a ham radio operator's event in a picnic area of the Elkhorn Mountains. The event was sponsored by Capital City Radio Club, of which Kim Marshall was a member of. It was a very pleasant summer day, and Nyleen was with a group of other children playing by a shallow creek near the picnic area catching frogs. Around 4 p.m., Nyleen, barefoot and wearing a yellow t-shirt and shorts, disappeared from the area seemingly in the blink of an eye. But what really happened to her? I do want to take the time to mention that in these old cases, accurate information can be scarce. Many of us have seen the Unsolved Mysteries segment, and I am including some information from there, but I did choose to mainly base the information in here from old newspaper articles from around the time of the disappearance. There were things contained in these articles that I had never heard anywhere else and will be mentioning. I feel like they can sometimes be more accurate than the more recent articles online because they are often based on eyewitness testimony and interviews of people at the time and will give us the best idea of what actually happened on that day almost 41 years ago. As soon as it was realized that Nyleen was missing, a massive search was underway. It would be very intensive, involving hundreds of volunteers. They searched beaver dams, lakes, and creeks using dogs, helicopters, as well as aerial searches that involved infrared sensors using heat detection. The Elkhorn Mountains are very rugged terrain, and the search was hampered by dense foliage as well as heavy thunderstorms. In fact, Lewis and Clark County search coordinator Ralph DeCunzen was quoted in a newspaper article as saying, "Undergrowth in the area was so thick that searchers could have walked past the child and not seen her." He goes on to say that sometimes small frightened children will curl up and hide and won't answer searchers' calls. Sadly, the full-scale search was called off after 10 days because, according to Sheriff Tom Dawson, after conferring with medical authorities throughout the nation, a decision was made to wind the search down. Heavy rains and low temperatures have made the youngsters' survival virtually impossible. There has been much attention given to a possible sighting of a strange man in a jogging suit near the picnic area around the time when Nyleen went missing. I was surprised to find not much mention of him in the articles around the time Nyleen went missing. In fact, in the days after the disappearance, this was reported in the newspaper. Officials said Tuesday that any chances of foul play or kidnapping had been ruled out because the area was so isolated and those attending the exercise were mostly close friends of the family. It was only 5 days later that two very young children came forward and said that they saw one man near the area in a jogging suit they didn't recognize. I couldn't find any accounts of adult sightings of this unknown man, however. There was also the follow the shadow comment, which is a little vague. It was reported by some children that Nyleen was possibly playing this game with the unknown man and speculated that's how he was able to get her away from the group. However, in one newspaper account, it said that after a childhood squabble, Nyleen ran away from the group. The account of the disappearance found in an old newspaper article was that Nyleen was being watched around the time she went missing by a 13-year-old girl. She told Nyleen to wait at a specific spot while she ran back to the campsite briefly. As the girl ran away, Nyleen said to her, "My brother can run faster than you." She returned a few minutes later, and Nyleen was gone. Of course, with the large-scale search being called off, Nancy and Kim Marshall were still desperately searching for their child. They were doing everything they could think of to find her and get her name out in the public. They even briefly created a nonprofit search dog corporation called Big Sky Rescue Dogs that would train dogs to search for human scent. This specific type of trained dog was not available immediately after Nyleen went missing, and they felt it would have been a very valuable tool in helping to find her. 9 months after Nyleen went missing, the Marshalls would also bring in Dr. John Watkins to hypnotize 7 people who were near Nyleen when she vanished. They had a composite sketch created from some of the people's recollections. It is reported that the sketch resembled a man wanted for child molesting and grand larceny in other states, but no other information was given concerning that. 4 months after Nyleen's disappearance, the movie Adam, profiling the abduction and murder of Adam Walsh, was aired on national television. After the movie, 55 pictures of missing children were shown on the screen. Nyleen's picture was one of them. No substantial tips were called in concerning her, but Child Find of America did print and distribute posters of Nyleen in hopes that someone had seen her. She was also featured on grocery sacks, milk cartons, as well as billboards. Then, in late 1985, phone calls and letters would be received by someone claiming to have abducted Nyleen. He contacted Child Find Incorporated as well as the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They were able to trace the phone calls he made to a phone booth in Madison, Wisconsin. However, after the calls had been traced, they stopped. It is reported the last phone call was placed in May of 1986, and the last letter postmarked soon after. It was stated that the letters contained information that hadn't been released to the public. However, there has never been any mention of what the information might have been, even all these years later. The author did possibly give a clue to his identity, mentioning that he had lost his parents and 9-year-old sister in a car crash years prior. Here are the 3 excerpts of the letters that have been released below. There are a few sentences that I have decided to leave out because, quite honestly, it's very disturbing and would be considered a form of molestation. If you would like to read the entire excerpt, it is mentioned in Nyleen's article on my website. Here are the excerpts that were released.
I didn't want their person to try to get information from her. All I could tell them was that she was okay. I hope Child Find can get the following back to her family. I picked Kay up on the road in the Elkhorn Park area between Helena and Boulder. She was crying and frightened, and as I held her, she was shaking, and I decided that I would keep her and love her. I took her home with me. I have a nice investment income, and I can work at home, so I can care for her myself all the time. I teach her at home, and she likes to go with me when I travel. Her hair is short and curly now, and she has really grown. She is about 45 inches and around 50 pounds. She has all 4 of her permanent upper and 2 of her lower incisors at this time. She takes a bath and brushes her teeth every day. She eats well. Her favorite meal is pizza and cherry Coke. She would gladly recount to you trips to San Francisco, New York, Oklahoma City, New Orleans, Nashville, Chicago, Puerto Rico, and Canada. We were even in Britain for a month last year, and she loved it. Nobody questions passports. She is a sweet little girl, and it is because of how much I have grown to love her that I realize how much her family must miss her. But she has adjusted and seems happy. She trusts me and isn't afraid. We play a lot and she laughs when we clown around. She smiles and acts coy when I tease her. She giggles when we snuggle and hugs me sometimes for no apparent reason. I love her and I have her. I just can't let her go.
There didn't appear to be much mention of this letter in the press initially. Perhaps law enforcement didn't want it out there until it could be further investigated. Unsolved Mysteries did film a segment on Nyleen's disappearance, and it aired in November of 1991. They mentioned the letters and phone calls, and then much more attention was given publicly to this possible development. Some positive things did transpire as a result of the broadcast. However, Nyleen being located, sadly, would not be one of them. A teacher in British Columbia had thought that one of her students was Nyleen K. Marshall. The student's father had always acted suspiciously, and she thought there was a resemblance and called authorities. It turns out it wasn't Nyleen, but another missing child, Monica Bonilla, who was abducted by her father 8 years earlier. Monica was soon reunited with her mother. Jefferson County Undersheriff Tim Campbell did state that every time Unsolved Mysteries re-aired the case, he got a few new tips to work with. He even said that the tips have led to 3 other lost children from around the country being reunited with their families. There were a few other possible leads in Nyleen's disappearance that I will mention, but sadly nothing ever appeared to come of them. First off, we'll talk about Richard James Wilson. He was a Helena resident with a history of mental illness. He turned himself in August of 1991, saying that he had killed Nyleen K. Marshall as well as another woman. They were never able to verify his story, and there was even a search where he claimed to have buried Nyleen's remains that yielded nothing. With his unstable mental history past, it was thought to have been a false confession. There was also a brief and somewhat cryptic mention in an interview with Kim and Nancy Marshall about a possible lead. They were told a picture of a girl closely resembling Nyleen was found with other pictures in a place where a suspect had apparently been. The girl seemed to have been beaten. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children did not say it was for sure Nyleen, but said of the thousands of children on their list, it looks more like their daughter than anyone else. The Marshalls continued to be diligent in searching for their child. They wanted to make an age-progressed sketch of Nyleen. However, that was hindered when it was learned all the photos they had sent of their daughter perished in a fire at the FBI lab. Another report states that several years after Nyleen's disappearance, her uncle saw a composite drawing of a couple wanted in another state for child abduction. He said the faces in the sketch closely resembled a couple he remembers seeing on the scene the first day of the search for Nyleen. Sadly, years would go by with no leads or developments in the case. Then, just after the 12th anniversary of Nyleen's disappearance, something would again happen to this family that is almost too horrible to believe. The Marshalls had been living in Japan for several years as Kim Marshall had been sent there for work. He was next being transferred to Mexico. Kim and his children stayed behind in Japan to finish moving, while Nancy Marshall flew to Mexico to look at possible houses for the family. Kim was at the Tokyo airport ready to leave the country and join his wife when he received a phone call. Nancy Marshall was dead. She had reportedly met with friends the night before and was in good spirits. She was discovered in her room the next day at the upscale Radisson Paraiso Hotel in Mexico City. Nancy was found hanging from a shower rod with her hands tied behind her back. She had been bruised and beaten, and her wedding ring, watch, and a bottle of perfume were missing. The money and valuables in her safe were untouched. It was also discovered that Nancy's hotel room door had been kicked in. Mexican authorities actually listed Nancy Marshall's death initially as a suicide. Kim Marshall was livid. He hired a PI, and the authorities changed their classification to under investigation. Kim was extremely frustrated with the developments in the case. He says he was advised by the State Department to not push an investigation of murder. They said it would prevent them from releasing Nancy's body for burial. Although convinced his wife's death was a murder, Kim didn't press because, as he stated, he refused to let her body rot in a Mexican morgue. Nancy's body was released to the family, and she was buried in Texas. There was another possible development in the case that happened 15 years after Nyleen's disappearance. A man and a pregnant woman walked into a New Orleans hospital. The 19-year-old woman was about to give birth. However, after being questioned by the hospital staff, the couple abruptly left. The teenager called herself Helena and said she thought her mother may have been named Nyleen, but remembers very little of her childhood. She also said she grew up in another country, but had no trace of an accent. One of the nurses had recently watched Nyleen's segment on Unsolved Mysteries and wondered if it could be her, so authorities were called. The couple were tracked down and were found to reside in Oklahoma City and were questioned. The woman did agree to give a DNA sample. It was a longer process than usual because Nancy was now deceased and her blood sample was 10 years old and deteriorated. They were able to track down Nyleen's biological father and get a sample from him. There was no other mention of this story, so I'm assuming the DNA was not a match to Nyleen. I do want to mention that a few months after I posted my article, I was contacted by a relative of Nyleen's. I will keep the identity of them private. They told me they appreciated my article and wanted to let me know they were glad that I didn't cast suspicion on Nyleen's stepfather, Kim, in my article. They expressed sorrow, of course, at Nyleen's disappearance as well as Nancy's murder. It appears that Nancy was as kind and as lovely of a person as I always thought she came across in the Unsolved Mysteries segment. One thing this person did add was the night before Nancy's murder, she expressed she had the feeling she was being followed. I will say that I have also been contacted by two people since I posted my article that wonder if they could be Nyleen, but from what they have told me, I don't think there is any chance that that is the case. Now it's time for my thoughts on this case, and they may surprise you. My first knowledge of this case was from watching it on Unsolved Mysteries, and the way they portrayed it, it definitely seemed like an abduction. However, the more I delve into it, I'm not so sure that Nyleen was abducted at all. She was last seen near a heavily wooded area in the mountains, and the strange man in the area wasn't widely seen, just by a few young children who didn't recognize him. If there was a child predator looking for a victim, he probably wouldn't want to be where there are a lot of adults around. I would also think if there were a strange man lurking around the area, many of the people at the picnic would remember seeing him. The search was extensive, but the head of the search even said, with how thick the brush was, someone could have walked right past her and not seen her. If the accounts were accurate about the girl who was watching Nyleen stepping away for a few minutes, it is definitely possible that Nyleen decided to start exploring and quickly got lost in the mountains, perhaps to die of exposure or sadly an animal attack. I will give my thoughts on these anonymous phone calls and letters. I really find it difficult to take them seriously. There were just vague reports in the media, I saw nothing from law enforcement, that he mentioned things in the letter that were not released. The things he said concerning Nyleen seemed specific, but could not have been verified, of course, anyway, because no one had seen Nyleen in 2.5 years. The details he mentioned about Nyleen concerning her could not have been verified by her family and could have been true about any child. Even if Nyleen were abducted, the tone in the letters are not to be believed. How many child predators who stalk a private picnic and abduct a young child treat her with kindness and love and raise her as her parents would? Sadly, it never happens that way. There is a chance, albeit slight in my opinion, that the letter writer did abduct her and perhaps murdered her, and these letters are an attempt to ease his conscience by giving her parents hope that she is alive and well. I think it is very possible, though, that it is just a cruel hoax, and sadly we hear about these types of things all the time. If Nyleen K. Marshall just wanted to explore and got lost in the mountains, never to be found again, she is a very sad statistic. Tragically, something that has happened many times over the years. If she were abducted by a strange man that day and raised as his own, all the while molesting her, as referenced in the letter, and reporting all the details of her new life to her parents, that is the very definition of sadistic. It does seem that without finding Nyleen, as a now 45-year-old adult, we will never know what happened that day. No matter how it happened, the truth is that a beautiful 4-year-old girl vanished that day. Kim Marshall is quoted as saying about his daughter, "She was more than a good child. She was angelic. She was really the most sweetest, pleasant child you can imagine." It appears that Nyleen K. Marshall will forever remain a sweet 4-year-old child and will never fully know whether her disappearance was a statistic or sadistic. That concludes the podcast on Nyleen K. Marshall. If you enjoyed it, please leave me a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find my podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio. It is one word, Lost and Found Podcast. I post a new podcast every other Sunday, and as always, you can find all of my articles as well as links to my latest podcasts on my website at Lost and Found Blogs. And you can contact me via email at lostandfoundpodcast@yahoo. And remember that cold cases stay cold because their story stops getting told.